Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I should have trusted my gut when Supervisor Rodriguez called me into his office that Tuesday morning in September 2023. The way he avoided eye contact, shuffling papers around his desk like he was buying time, should have been my first red flag. But at 26, I was still naive enough to think this job would be straightforward. "We need someone reliable for the night tower shifts," he said, finally looking up from his coffee-stained incident reports. 3 people have quit in the past month. No explanations, just walked away from decent pay. The Clearwater State Park fire tower had been my daytime assignment for 8 months. I knew every hiking trail, every camping spot, every inch of the 12,000-acre preserve. During daylight hours, it was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in oak and pine, crystal clear streams, and that massive lagoon where families brought their kids to fish. But I'd never stayed past sunset. "What happened to the night crew?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Rodriguez shrugged, but something flickered across his face. "People get spooked in the dark. You know how it is. Sounds get amplified, shadows play tricks. Nothing you can't handle." The pay bump was substantial, nearly double my current rate. I was saving for a down payment on a house, and my girlfriend Jessica had been hinting about moving in together. The extra money would make a real difference. "When do I start?" "Tonight. Sorry for the short notice, but we're desperate. The tower can't stay unmanned, especially with fire season running late this year." I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself this was a good opportunity. Night shifts meant fewer tourists, fewer emergencies, fewer distractions. I could read, maybe work on the novel I'd been putting off. How hard could it be to sit in a tower and watch for smoke? Jessica wasn't thrilled when I called her that afternoon. "You're going to be alone up there all night? What if something happens?" "It's a fire tower, not a haunted house." I laughed, but her concern made me uneasy. "I'll have radio contact with the ranger station. It's probably the safest job in the county." By 8 p.m. I was loading my truck with supplies, a thermos of coffee, energy bars, my laptop, a thick Stephen King novel I'd been meaning to finish. The irony of bringing horror fiction to a night watch wasn't lost on me, but I figured it would help pass the time. The drive to the tower took me along a winding dirt road that cut through the densest part of the park. During the day, sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. At night, my headlights carved a narrow tunnel through absolute darkness. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches scratching against my truck's roof like fingernails on a chalkboard. I parked at the base of the fire tower and grabbed my gear. The structure loomed overhead, a skeletal frame of steel and wood rising 90 feet into the night sky. My legs were already aching just thinking about the climb. The metal steps rang out with each footfall, echoing through the forest in a rhythm that seemed too loud, too intrusive. Halfway up, I paused to catch my breath and looked out over the canopy. The park stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of black broken only by the occasional glimmer of moonlight on water. That's when I first noticed the silence. Not complete silence. There were still the usual night sounds. Owls hooting in the distance, leaves rustling in the breeze, the occasional crack of a settling tree. But something felt muted, like the forest was holding back, waiting for something. I shook off the feeling and continued climbing. By the time I reached the cab at the top, my legs felt like rubber, and my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool October air. The tower cab was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 12 feet square with windows on 3 sides and a door facing west. The fourth wall housed a narrow bed, a kitchenette with a mini fridge and microwave, and the communication station. Red and green lights blinked on the radio equipment, and a logbook sat open on the desk, filled with entries from previous night watchers. I flipped through a few pages, looking for clues about why so many people had quit. Most entries were routine. Quiet night. No incidents. Light fog over eastern sector. Family of deer near trail marker 7. But as I got to more recent entries, the tone shifted. Strange sounds from Lagoon area, 2:30 a.m., unable to locate source. Motion detected south of tower, investigated at dawn, nothing found. Recommend additional lighting for tower base. The final entry was dated just 5 days ago, written in shaky handwriting. Something's not right here. Can't explain it. Don't think I'm coming back. I closed the logbook and tested the radio. Static popped and hissed, but eventually, a familiar voice came through. Tower 1, this is base. You copy? It was Jimmy Castillo, the night dispatcher. We'd worked together during summer fire season, and hearing his voice eased some of my tension. Copy, base. Just got settled in. Everything looks good up here. Roger that. Remember, you've got binoculars on the desk and a high-powered flashlight in the equipment locker. Weather service is calling for clear skies, so visibility should be excellent. Any questions? Yeah, actually. What happened to the previous night crew? Rodriguez mentioned people quitting, but didn't give details. A pause. Honestly, I don't know. Gary Hendricks lasted 3 weeks, then just stopped showing up. Before him was Monica Shaw. Good ranger, 10 years experience. She put in for a transfer after 2 nights. Wouldn't say why. Any incidents? Equipment failures? Safety issues? Nothing official. Look, you seem level-headed. Probably just people letting their imaginations run wild. You'll be fine. The reassurance helped, but something in Jimmy's tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced either. I signed off and took my first proper look around. The tower's windows provided a 270-degree view of the park. To the north, rolling hills disappeared into darkness. East and south were dense forest, broken by clearings and the occasional service road. To the west lay the lagoon, a kidney-shaped body of water covering maybe 50 acres. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see lily pads floating on the surface and the white trunks of dead trees rising from the shallows like bone fingers. The view was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. During the day, the lagoon attracted families and photographers. At night, it looked primordial, like something that belonged in a much older, wilder world. I set up my equipment and settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet 12-hour shift. The coffee was hot, the radio was working, and I had enough snacks to feed a small army. What could go wrong? By 10 p.m., I'd established a routine. Every 15 minutes, I'd sweep the binoculars across my assigned sectors, checking for any signs of smoke or unusual activity. Between sweeps, I worked on incident reports from my day shifts and answered the occasional radio check from base. The forest had fully awakened by then. Bats flitted past the windows, their erratic flight patterns visible against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the distance, a great horned owl called to its mate, the deep hoots echoing across the valley. The sounds were comforting, familiar. This was the natural world doing what it was supposed to do. I was midway through my third cup of coffee when I saw the first sign that this night would be different. Through the binoculars, I spotted movement near the eastern ridge, a pale shape that stood out against the dark tree line. At first glance, it looked like a large boulder or fallen log, but something about it nagged at me. The shape was too regular, too symmetrical. I adjusted the focus and felt my stomach drop. It was a figure, human-sized, covered in what looked like a white sheet or blanket. 2 dark patches where eyes might be seen to stare directly at the tower. My rational mind immediately went to explanations. A lost hiker wrapped in an emergency blanket. A homeless person who'd wandered into the park. Maybe even a prank. Though who would be stupid enough to wander around state land in the middle of the night dressed like a cheap Halloween ghost? The figure didn't move. For 5 full minutes, I watched through the binoculars as it stood motionless on the ridge, facing the tower. The moonlight was bright enough to cast shadows, but the thing under the sheet seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I reached for the radio, hesitating. Calling in a suspicious person report felt like overkill, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest had gone quiet again. No owl calls, no rustling leaves. Even the ever-present cricket chorus had faded to whispers. Base, This is Tower 1. I've got eyes on a possible trespasser in grid sector 4. Individual appears to be wearing white clothing or covering. Can you send someone to check it out? Jimmy's voice crackled back immediately. Copy that, Tower 1. I'll radio Ranger Valdez. He's patrolling the south end. ETA may be 20 minutes. Roger. I'll keep visual contact and update if the situation changes. I settled back with the binoculars, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. The figure remained perfectly still, like a statue. No swaying in the breeze, no shifting from foot to foot, no human mannerisms whatsoever. 15 minutes later, I caught the flicker of a flashlight beam moving through the trees below. Ranger Carlos Valdez was making his way toward the ridge, following one of the maintenance trails. I'd worked with Carlos before, mid-40s, former military, not someone who spooked easily. Tower 1, I'm approaching the location. Still have visual on your trespasser? I swept the binoculars across the ridge and felt my blood pressure spike. Negative base. The figure is gone. No sign of movement, no indication of direction traveled. Carlos's flashlight continued to bob through the trees, getting closer to where I'd seen the shape. The beam was powerful, one of those tactical LED units that could light up a football field. If someone was hiding in that area, he'd find them. Tower 1, I'm at your coordinates. No sign of anyone. Lots of footprints, though. Looks like someone was standing here for a while. Fresh prints? Hard to tell in this light, but they don't look old. Bare feet, which is weird for this terrain, and... His voice trailed off. What is it, Carlos? These prints are deep. Like, really deep. Either this person weighs 300 pounds, or they were carrying something heavy. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Any other signs? Dropped items, broken branches? Negative. Just the prints leading down toward the lagoon. I'll follow them for a bit, but if they head into the water, I'm calling it a night. Carlos's flashlight beam moved away from the ridge, weaving between trees as he followed the mysterious trail. From my vantage point, I could track his progress for maybe half a mile before the forest swallowed him up. Base, this is Valdez. Trail ends at the lagoon's edge. Prints go right to the water, then nothing. Either this person took a midnight swim, or... He paused. Actually, I don't know what else it could be. Any indication they came back out? I walked the shoreline for 50 yards in both directions. No exit prints, no wet footprints on dry ground. It's like they just vanished into the water. The radio fell silent except for static. I swept the binoculars across the lagoon, looking for any sign of movement on the dark surface. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the moon like a black mirror. Carlos, you still there? Yeah, I'm here. Look, this is probably nothing. Could be an old vagrant's trail that I'm misreading in the dark. I'm going to head back to the station, file a report in the morning. Copy that. Thanks for checking it out. But after Carlos's flashlight disappeared and the radio went quiet, I couldn't settle back into my routine. The incident felt incomplete, unresolved. Who hikes through state forest barefoot in the middle of the night? Who stands motionless on a ridge for 15 minutes, then vanishes without a trace? I kept returning to the binoculars, scanning the area where I'd seen the figure. The ridge was empty now, just trees and shadows and the pale scar of the hiking trail. But every few minutes, I'd catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a white shape darting between trees, or a pale reflection on the water's surface. Each time I focused on the spot, there was nothing there. By midnight, my nerves were frayed. Every sound seemed amplified. The settling of the tower's wooden frame, the whisper of wind through the windows, the distant splash of something large entering the lagoon. I'd started a fresh pot of coffee, more for the ritual than the caffeine, when the radio crackled to life. Tower 1, this is Base. How's your first night going? Jimmy's voice was a welcome intrusion into my spiraling thoughts. Quiet now. Had that trespasser situation around 10:30, but Carlos checked it out. Probably nothing. Yeah, he mentioned it when he checked in. Weird deal with those footprints, though. Carlos doesn't spook easy, and he sounded rattled. What do you mean? Said the prints were too deep, too perfect. like someone had pressed feet-shaped molds into the mud. But who the hell would do something like that? The question hung in the air. I didn't have an answer, and apparently neither did Jimmy. "Look," he continued, "I've been monitoring the night shifts for 3 years. Weird stuff happens out there, especially around the lagoon. Most of it's explainable. Animals, weather, people's imagination working overtime. But sometimes..." He trailed off. "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes things happen that don't fit into neat categories. My advice? Document everything, trust your instincts, and don't let your guard down. The night shift isn't just about watching for fires." The line went dead, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the vast darkness pressing against the windows. I tried to focus on my book, but the words swam on the page. Every few minutes I'd glance up to scan the forest, half expecting to see that pale figure watching me from the tree line. The night was still young, and already I understood why so many people had quit. There was something wrong with this place after dark, something that made the hair on your arms stand up and your mouth go dry. I checked my watch. 12:37 a.m., 7.5 hours until sunrise. It was going to be a very long night. The next 2 hours passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. It wasn't just paranoia. There's a difference between general unease and the specific sensation of eyes tracking your movement. I'd felt it before, while hunting with my father as a teenager. That moment when you realize the deer you've been stalking has been watching you the entire time. I tried to stay focused on my duties, sweeping the binoculars across assigned sectors, updating the logbook, responding to radio checks. But every few minutes my gaze would drift to the windows, searching the darkness for something I couldn't name. At 2:15 a.m., I found it. Or rather, it found me. I was refilling my coffee mug when movement caught my eye through the eastern window. A pale shape moved between the trees roughly a quarter mile from the tower base. This time, it wasn't standing still on a distant ridge. It was moving closer. I grabbed the binoculars and focused on the area. The figure was definitely human-shaped, covered in what looked like a bedsheet or tarp. But something was wrong with the way it moved. The gait was too fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. No bobbing motion, no irregular steps to navigate the rough terrain. And it was heading directly toward the tower. My hands shook as I reached for the radio. "Base, this is Tower 1. I've got another visual on that trespasser. Individual is approaching the tower from the east, approximately quarter mile out." Jimmy's response was immediate. "Copy, Tower 1. I'll dispatch Valdez again. Can you give me a description?" I pressed the binoculars to my eyes, trying to make out details in the moonlight. Tall figure, maybe 6 feet. Covered in white material. Could be a sheet or emergency blanket. Moving at a steady pace toward tower base. Any signs of distress? Could this be a lost hiker? I watched the figure navigate a fallen log without breaking stride, then continue its inexorable approach. Negative. Movement appears deliberate and controlled, no indication of confusion or disorientation. The figure was close enough now that I could make out individual folds in whatever was covering it. It moved with unsettling purpose, never pausing to check directions or avoid obstacles. It knew exactly where it was going. "ETA for backup?" I asked, trying to keep the tension out of my voice. "Valdez is 20 minutes out. Can you maintain visual contact?" Affirmative. But as I watched, the figure disappeared behind a stand of thick pines. I swept the binoculars left and right, searching for any sign of white in the darkness. Minutes passed. Nothing. "Base, I've lost visual contact. Target disappeared into heavy cover about 200 yards northeast of the tower." "Copy that. Valdez is en route. Stay alert and report any changes." I set down the binoculars and moved to the window facing northeast. The forest was a wall of black shadows punctuated by the silver gleam of moonlight on leaves. If someone was moving through those trees, they'd have to be practically on top of the tower before I'd see them. That's when I heard the first footstep on the metal stairs below. The sound was unmistakable. the hollow ring of boot on steel that every fire tower ranger knew by heart. Someone was climbing toward the cab, and they weren't trying to be quiet about it. I grabbed the high-powered flashlight from the equipment locker and moved to the door. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I called down the stairwell. "This is a restricted area. You need to identify yourself and state your business." No response. But the footsteps continued, slow and methodical, climbing toward me one step at a time. I keyed the radio with trembling fingers. "Base, this is Tower 1. I have an individual climbing the tower stairs. No response to verbal commands." "Copy. Tower 1. Do not engage. Valdez is 15 minutes out." 15 minutes. The climb to the cab took maybe 3 minutes for someone in decent shape. I did the math and didn't like the result. The footsteps were getting closer. I could hear them clearly now through the floor of the cab, a steady rhythm that never varied, never paused. Whoever was climbing wasn't tired, wasn't stopping to rest, wasn't even breathing hard from the exertion. I turned off the cabin lights and pressed myself against the wall beside the door, flashlight in one hand, radio in the other. Through the window, I could see the top of the stairwell where whoever was climbing would emerge. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched for 30 seconds, then a full minute. Had they given up? Changed their mind? Or were they just standing there, waiting for something? I was about to key the radio when I heard a new sound, a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the metal platform outside the door. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the door, starting at the bottom and working their way up. The sound made my teeth ache. It wasn't random. There was a pattern to it, almost like someone was trying to write something. "Base, this is Tower 1, I whispered into the radio. "Individual has reached the platform. They're doing something to the door." "What kind of something?" Before I could answer, the scratching stopped. The platform outside fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the tower's support beams. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. Nothing. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek through the window beside the door. The platform was empty. No sign that anyone had been there at all. "Base, the platform appears clear. No visual on the trespasser." "Copy that. Valdez is 5 minutes out. Sit tight." I stayed pressed against the wall, flashlight ready, until I saw Carlos's headlights on the access road below. When his flashlight beam started climbing the tower stairs, I nearly cried with relief. "Tower 1, this is Valdez. I'm coming up." I unlocked the door and stepped onto the platform. Carlos emerged from the stairwell, breathing hard but alert. His flashlight swept across the platform's metal grating. "You said someone was up here?" "Yeah, maybe 20 minutes ago. Heard them climbing, then scratching at the door." Carlos knelt beside the door, examining something. "Well, someone was definitely here. Look at this." He shined his light on a series of deep gouges in the wooden door frame. They were too regular to be accidental damage, too deep to be made by fingernails. Whatever had made them was sharp and applied with considerable force. "These are fresh," Carlos said, running his finger along one of the scratches. "Still have wood splinters sticking out." I shined my own light on the marks and felt my stomach turn. They formed a pattern, not random scratches but deliberate marks. Letters, though I couldn't make out what they spelled. "Can you read that?" I asked. Carlos angled his light differently and the gouges became clearer. "Looks like, 'Come down.'" Jesus. Someone carved "Come down" into your door. We stood there in silence, staring at the threatening message. The wind had picked up, making the tower sway slightly on its supports. Below us, the forest stretched endlessly into darkness. "I'm calling this in," Carlos said. "This isn't just trespassing anymore. Someone's making threats and they've got tools capable of carving through hardwood." He radioed base while I examined the platform more closely. No sign of how the person had left. No rope marks on the railings. No indication they'd climbed down the stairs. It was as if they'd simply vanished into the night air. Carlos spent another hour searching the area around the tower base, but found nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches to indicate someone crashing through the underbrush. The only evidence that anyone had been there at all was the message carved into my door. "I don't like leaving you up here alone," Carlos said when he finished his search. "This whole situation feels wrong." "I'm okay," I lied. "Just a few more hours until sunrise." But as Carlos's flashlight disappeared into the forest and I was alone again, I stared at those carved letters and wondered what kind of person could climb 90 feet of metal stairs without making a sound until they wanted to be heard, and what they wanted me to come down for. After Carlos left, I couldn't bring myself to turn the cabin lights back on. Something about sitting in that illuminated fishbowl while unknown threats moved through the darkness felt like suicide. Instead, I relied on my flashlight and the pale moonlight filtering through the windows. The carved message haunted me. Every few minutes, I'd shine my light on those gouges in the doorframe, hoping they'd somehow disappear or reveal themselves to be natural weathering. But they remained stubbornly real. Deep, deliberate letters that spelled out an invitation I had no intention of accepting. I tried to focus on my duties, but scanning the forest through binoculars had become an exercise in terror. Every shadow could hide a figure in white. Every rustle of leaves might signal someone's approach. The darkness that had once seemed peaceful now felt alive with malevolent intent. At 3:30 a.m., I was updating the incident log when the radio crackled to life. "Tower 1, this is base. Status report." Jimmy's voice was tense. In the background, I could hear multiple conversations and the sound of equipment being moved around. "All quiet up here since Valdez finished his sweep." "Why? Something wrong at base?" "We've got a situation developing. Ranger Martinez was doing a perimeter check along Highway 78 when she found a vehicle in the parking area near trail marker 12. Engine still warm, driver's door open, keys in the ignition. Trail marker 12 was less than a mile from my tower on the western edge of the lagoon. I'd hiked that area countless times during day shifts. Any sign of the driver? Negative. Martinez is tracking footprints from the vehicle toward the water. Looks like someone left in a hurry. Personal items scattered around the car, including a cell phone and wallet. ID on the vehicle owner? Linda Washington, 43, from Riverside. Her emergency contact says she was planning a solo camping trip, but she didn't have a permit for overnight stays. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. You think this is connected to what's been happening up here? I don't know what to think anymore. 3 rangers reporting unusual activity, mysterious footprints leading into the lagoon, threatening messages carved into government property. Either we've got someone seriously disturbed operating in our park, or... He paused. Or what? Or something else entirely. Martinez just radioed in. The footprints lead right to the water's edge, same as before. No sign they came back out. I grabbed the binoculars and swept them across the lagoon. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the moon like black glass. If someone had entered that water 3 hours ago, there should be ripples, disturbance, some indication of recent activity. Jimmy, I'm looking at the lagoon now. Water's completely calm. If someone went in tonight, they didn't make much of a splash. That's what's bothering me. Martinez says the footprints are fresh. Can't be more than a few hours old. But there's no sign of struggle, no indication of an accident. Just tracks leading into the water and stopping. I lowered the binoculars and felt my blood pressure spike. Moving across the lagoon's surface about 50 yards from shore was a wake. Not the random disturbance of wind or wildlife, but a deliberate V-shaped pattern moving steadily through the water. Base, I've got movement on the lagoon. Something large moving through the water, heading toward the eastern shore. What kind of movement? Could be a beaver or otter. I focused the binoculars on the wake. Whatever was creating it was substantial, too big for any native wildlife. And it was moving with purpose, following a straight line toward a small cove where the forest came right down to the water's edge. Negative on wildlife. This is something big, and it's moving deliberately. I'm going to lose sight when it reaches the eastern shore. Copy that. I'm dispatching Martinez to that area. Can you maintain visual contact? I tracked the wake until it reached the shallow water near shore, then lost it in the reeds and shadows. For 5 minutes, I swept the binoculars along the shoreline, looking for any sign of whatever had created the disturbance. Tower 1, this is Martinez. I'm at the eastern shore of the lagoon. No sign of anything in the water or on land. Copy, Martinez. The wake I observed terminated in your area approximately 10 minutes ago. Well, whatever it was, it's gone now. But I found something else you might find interesting. There's a path here I've never noticed before. Looks like it leads up from the water toward the ridge trail. My blood pressure spiked. Can you describe this path? Muddy, like something heavy was dragged along it. And there are those same deep footprints we've been finding. Bare feet, but pressed into the ground like the person weighed 300 pounds. I thought about the figure I'd seen earlier, gliding through the forest with that unnaturally smooth gait. Martinez, I need you to be extremely careful. Do not follow that trail alone. Why? What do you know that I don't? Before I could answer, my attention was drawn to movement on the ridge above Martinez's position. Through the binoculars, I could see a pale shape moving through the trees about 100 yards uphill from where she was investigating. Martinez, you need to get out of there now. I've got visual on an unknown individual on the ridge above your position. What kind of individual? The figure stopped moving and turned toward the lagoon. Even at this distance, even through binoculars, I could feel its attention focused on Martinez like a laser. Tall figure in white clothing or covering. They're watching you from the ridge trail. Get back to your vehicle and wait for backup. I don't see anyone. Are you sure? I watched in horror as the figure began moving down the hillside toward Martinez's position. Not walking or running, but flowing like water, navigating obstacles without pause or hesitation. Martinez, you need to move now. The individual is heading directly toward you. I'm not seeing anything, Tower 1. Are you sure you're not? Her radio cut off mid-sentence. Martinez, respond. Come in, Martinez. Static. I grabbed my high-powered flashlight and aimed it toward the eastern shore, switching it on and off in the emergency signal pattern. If Martinez was in trouble, maybe I could distract whatever was moving toward her. The response was immediate and terrifying. A brilliant white light appeared on the ridge, brighter than any flashlight, brighter than vehicle headlights. It pulsed once, twice, then began moving rapidly toward the lagoon. Not bobbing like someone running with a light, but gliding smoothly through the forest. Base, this is Tower 1. I've lost contact with Martinez. There's someone or something with an extremely bright light source moving toward her last known position. I'm signaling with my flashlight but getting no response. Jimmy's voice was tight with concern. All units, respond to Lagoon Eastern Shore immediately. Martinez may be in distress. I kept the binoculars trained on the area where Martinez had been, sweeping back and forth, looking for any sign of her flashlight or uniform. The brilliant white light had reached the shore and stopped, pulsing slowly like a mechanical heartbeat. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The lagoon returned to its peaceful moonlit state. No movement on the water, no signs of disturbance on the shore. If I hadn't seen it myself, I'd have thought I was hallucinating. Base. The light source has disappeared. No visual on Martinez or any other personnel. Copy. Tower 1. ETA for backup units is 15 minutes. Can you maintain overwatch until they arrive? Affirmative. But as I swept the binoculars across the lagoon one more time, I spotted something that made my hands shake. Floating near the center of the water was a small, dark object. At this distance, it could have been debris or a piece of driftwood. But I was pretty sure it was Martinez's hat. The next hour was controlled chaos. 3 ranger vehicles converged on the lagoon's eastern shore, their headlights cutting through the darkness like search beacons. From my vantage point in the tower, I watched flashlight beams sweep through the forest and along the shoreline as teams searched for any trace of Martinez. I maintained radio contact, calling out anything I could see from above. The teams moved methodically, but I could hear the growing tension in their voices as minutes passed without finding her. Tower 1, this is Valdez. We found Martinez's radio about 50 yards from shore. Looks like it was dropped, not deliberately discarded. Any sign of Martinez herself? Negative. We're expanding the search pattern, but... His voice trailed off. But what? There's something weird about this area. The ground is torn up like there was a struggle, but the pattern doesn't make sense. It's like the earth was churned by something large dragging itself through the mud. I focused my binoculars on Valdez's position and could see several flashlights clustered around a muddy area near the water's edge. Even from 90 feet up, I could make out dark gouges in the earth. Can you describe the marks? Long parallel grooves, maybe 3 inches wide. Too big for fingernails, too regular for animal claws. And they all lead toward the water. The radio crackled with a new voice. Supervisor Rodriguez, who'd apparently been called in to manage the emergency. All units, this is command. We're treating this as a potential abduction. I want this entire area cordoned off as a crime scene. Nobody else goes near that water until the sheriff's department arrives. Copy, command. What about the search? We'll resume at first light with proper equipment and additional personnel. For now, establish a perimeter and wait for the investigators. I watched the team set up floodlights around the lagoon's eastern shore, turning night into harsh artificial day. The illumination revealed details that made my stomach churn. The muddy area where Martinez had vanished was larger than I'd realized, covering almost an acre of shoreline. The parallel gouges Valdez had described were everywhere, crisscrossing the ground in a chaotic pattern. Tower 1, this is Rodriguez. I need you to provide a detailed report of everything you observed tonight. Don't leave out anything, no matter how insignificant it seems. I spent the next 20 minutes describing the evening's events. The figure on the ridge, the wake moving across the lagoon, the brilliant white light, Martinez's radio cutting out. Rodriguez listened without interruption, but I could hear him taking notes. You mentioned seeing something floating in the lagoon. Can you still see it? I swept the binoculars across the water. The object was still there, maybe 20 yards from shore, dark against the moonlit surface. Affirmative. Small, dark object, possibly clothing or equipment. We'll check it out at first light. For now, I want you to maintain observation and report any changes. The day shift will relieve you at 800. As the search team settled into their perimeter positions, I tried to process what I'd witnessed. A fellow ranger had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only mysterious gouges in the mud and a dropped radio. Whatever had taken her was strong enough to overpower a trained law enforcement officer and leave no footprints or blood trail. I thought about the carved message on my door. Calm down. Had someone been trying to lure me away from the safety of the tower? Was Martinez's disappearance connected to the threats I'd been receiving? The possibility that I might have been the intended target made my hands shake. If I'd been foolish enough to investigate the lagoon personally, would I be the one missing right now? At 4:45 a.m., my radio crackled with an urgent call from one of the perimeter teams. Command, this is Stevens. I've got movement in the water. Something large just surfaced near the center of the lagoon. I grabbed the binoculars and focused on the lagoon's center. The water was disturbed, not just ripples, but actual waves rolling outward from a central point. Something substantial had definitely surfaced. I can confirm movement from the tower, I radioed. Large disturbance in the center of the lagoon. All units maintain positions but stay alert. Stevens, can you see what caused the disturbance? Negative, command. Whatever it was, it's gone back under. The waves continued to spread outward until they reached the shore, where they lapped gently against the mud. But in the brief moment when the water had been disturbed, I'd caught a glimpse of something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Something pale had broken the surface. Not smooth like a fish or mammal, but textured like waterlogged fabric. For just an instant, I'd seen what looked like a human form floating just beneath the surface, before it disappeared back into the dark water. Command, this is Tower 1. I think I saw a body in the water. The radio went silent for several seconds before Rodriguez responded. Describe what you observed. Pale object, human-sized, floating just beneath the surface when the disturbance occurred. Only visible for a few seconds before it submerged again. Copy that. We'll have divers here within the hour. But I knew no diver would find Martinez's body in that lagoon. Whatever had surfaced wasn't a corpse floating to the surface due to decomposition gases. It had moved with purpose, creating those waves deliberately before disappearing back into the depths. And if I was right about what I'd seen, Martinez wasn't dead. She was being held underwater by something that shouldn't exist. By 6 a.m., the lagoon looked like the staging area for a military operation. Sheriff's Department vehicles lined the access road, their red and blue lights painting the forest in harsh, strobing colors. The county dive team had arrived with their equipment truck, and investigators were photographing everything. The gouged mud, Martinez's abandoned radio, even the carved message on my tower door. Detective Sarah Kim climbed the tower stairs to interview me personally. She was young for a detective, maybe early 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she took her job seriously. "Tell me about the figure you saw," she said, settling into the tower's single chair while I remained standing by the windows. "Start from the beginning and don't leave out any details." I walked her through the entire night, the pale shape on the ridge, the footsteps on the tower stairs, the message carved into my door, Martinez's disappearance, and the disturbance in the lagoon. Kim took notes steadily, occasionally asking for clarification, but never interrupting my narrative. "This wake you observed moving across the water," she said when I finished. "Could it have been caused by a boat? Maybe someone with a small kayak or canoe?" I considered that, but there was no sound. Even electric trolling motors make noise, and this was completely silent. "What about the size? How big would something have to be to create the wake you described?" I thought about it carefully. Based on the V-shape and the speed of movement, I'd estimate something at least 6 feet long, probably larger. Kim made another note. "The other rangers mentioned finding unusually deep footprints. Did you observe anything like that yourself?" "No, but Valdez described them as being pressed into the ground like they were made by someone extremely heavy. That matches what I saw of the figure's movement. Too smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking normally." "You keep referring to it rather than him or her. Any particular reason?" I paused, trying to articulate the wrongness I'd sensed. "The way it moved wasn't natural. People have a rhythm when they walk. A slight bob, irregularity in their stride, adjustments for terrain. This thing moved like it was on rails." Kim closed her notebook and moved to the window facing the lagoon. Below us, the dive team was preparing their equipment while investigators continued photographing the shoreline. "I have to ask," she said without turning around. "Is there any possibility you were hallucinating? Sleep deprivation, stress, unfamiliar environment? All of those can cause visual disturbances." "I considered that," I admitted. "But other people saw evidence too. The footprints, the gouges in the mud, Martinez's abandoned radio. And I wasn't the only one who lost radio contact with her." Kim nodded. "You're right. Whatever happened here, it wasn't just in your head." The detective climbed back down to join the investigation, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing crowd of emergency personnel below. I watched through binoculars as the dive team entered the water, their bright yellow tanks and regulators stark against the dark lagoon. The search progressed methodically. 2 divers worked in a grid pattern, while a third remained on shore monitoring their air supply and radio communications. From my elevated position, I could track their progress by following the streams of bubbles rising to the surface. For the first hour, they found nothing unusual. Standard lagoon debris, fallen logs, discarded fishing equipment, the occasional beer bottle thrown in by careless visitors. But when they reached the center of the lagoon, where I'd seen the disturbance earlier, their pattern changed. "Command, this is Diver 1, crackled through the radio. "I'm finding some unusual formations on the bottom. Looks like the sediment has been disturbed in a regular pattern." "Describe what you're seeing." "It's hard to explain. The mud is gouged into parallel lines, similar to what we found on shore but much larger. And there are holes, deep circular openings in the lagoon floor. Detective Kim's voice joined the conversation. How deep are these holes? I can't see the bottom, even with my dive light. They appear to go down beyond the natural depth of the lagoon, and there's a current coming out of them, like they're connected to an underground water system. I focused my binoculars on the dive location. The water above the divers was slightly discolored, as if sediment was being stirred up from deep below. Diver 1, are you finding any sign of the missing ranger? Negative on Martinez. But there's something else down here. Some kind of fabric caught on a submerged log. It's unusual. Bring it up. I watched one of the divers surface and swim toward shore, something clutched in his gloved hand. The assembled investigators gathered around as he climbed out of the water and placed his find on a plastic evidence sheet. Even from the tower, I could see it was a piece of white cloth, roughly triangular in shape. But it wasn't normal fabric. It seemed to shift and flow even when perfectly still, like it was made of liquid instead of fiber. What the hell is that? Rodriguez asked, kneeling beside the evidence sheet. The diver shook his head. I've never seen anything like it. It doesn't feel like any material I know, more like thick plastic, but it moves like silk. Detective Kim borrowed a pair of tweezers and lifted the edge of the fabric. It rippled and flowed around the metal instrument as if it were alive. We need to get this to the lab immediately, she said, and I want soil samples from those holes on the lagoon floor. The dive team made 2 more trips to the bottom, collecting sediment and photographing the mysterious holes. Each time they surfaced, they reported the same thing. The openings appeared to be artificial, too regular to be natural formations, and they extended deeper than any standard diving equipment could explore. As the sun climbed higher and the morning light began to penetrate the forest canopy, the investigation took on a surreal quality. What had started as a missing person case was becoming something much stranger. Tower 1, this is Kim. I need you to remain available for follow-up questions. Don't leave the area until we've completed our preliminary investigation. Copy that. But Detective, what do you think happened here? There was a long pause before she responded. Honestly, I have no idea. But I can tell you one thing. This isn't a typical abduction case. The evidence doesn't fit any pattern I've seen before. As I watched the investigation continue below, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were looking in the wrong place. Whatever had taken Martinez wasn't hiding in the lagoon's depths or lurking in the surrounding forest. It was still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity to add to its collection. And next time, I might not be safe in my tower. By noon, the lagoon area looked like a disaster zone. Yellow crime scene tape blocked all hiking trails. Investigators swarmed over every inch of shoreline, and the dive team had made 6 separate trips to explore the mysterious holes on the lagoon floor. But despite all the activity, they were no closer to finding Martinez or understanding what had happened to her. I was finally allowed to leave the tower at 2 p.m., after giving a formal statement to Detective Kim and providing detailed sketches of everything I'd observed. My replacement, an older ranger named Pete Hoffman, arrived with explicit instructions to document any unusual activity and call for immediate backup if anything resembling the previous night's events occurred. You really think something grabbed Martinez? Pete asked as we completed the shift transition. I don't know what to think anymore, I admitted, but whatever happened here wasn't normal. The drive back to town gave me time to process the night's events. In daylight, with other people around and normal life continuing, it was tempting to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe the figure I'd seen was just a homeless person with unusual behavior patterns. Maybe Martinez had suffered some kind of accident and wandered off confused. Maybe the strange fabric was just pollution or debris. But the carved message on my door was real. The deep gouges in the shoreline mud were real. Martinez's disappearance was real. I got home to my apartment around 3 p.m., exhausted but too wired to sleep. Jessica was at work, so I had the place to myself. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the incident report I'd been asked to complete. That's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Is this the ranger who was working the tower last night? The voice was elderly, male, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Who is this? My name is Professor Walter Hayes. I retired from the university 3 years ago, but I've been following the reports about strange incidents at Clearwater Park. I think we need to talk. I'm not supposed to discuss ongoing investigations with civilians. Son, I've been studying unusual phenomena for 40 years. What you described to the police matches documented cases from 6 other locations across the country. If you want to understand what you're dealing with, meet me at Annie's Diner on Highway 78 in 1 hour. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, wondering how this Hayes person had gotten my number or learned details about my statement to the police. But his mention of 6 other locations had caught my attention. If similar incidents had occurred elsewhere, there might be patterns or explanations that could help find Martinez. Against my better judgment, I drove to Annie's Diner. Professor Hayes was easy to spot. Mid-70s, wild white hair, thick glasses, and a table covered with manila folders and old photographs. He looked like central casting's idea of an eccentric academic. "Thank you for coming," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "I know this seems irregular, but I've been tracking cases like yours for decades." "Cases like mine?" He opened one of the folders and pulled out a newspaper clipping dated 15 years earlier. The headline read, "Park Ranger Vanishes Near Arkansas Lake." Below it was a grainy photo of a lagoon that looked remarkably similar to the one at Clearwater. Ranger Mark Sullivan, Hayes said, disappeared while investigating reports of unusual activity around Crater Lake in Arkansas. Witnesses described a tall figure in white clothing and mysterious footprints leading into the water. Sound familiar? I scanned the article quickly. The similarities were striking. Nighttime encounters, pale figures, people vanishing near bodies of water with no trace except disturbed shorelines. This could be coincidence, I said, but Hayes was already pulling out more files. Minnesota, 2018. Oregon, 2020. New Mexico, 2019. He spread photos across the table, lagoons, small lakes, even a large pond, all with the same general characteristics. Dark water, surrounded by dense forest, located in isolated areas. 12 documented cases in the past 20 years, 7 people missing, never found. I studied the photos more carefully. Each location had an eerie similarity despite being thousands of miles apart. The water was always dark, almost black, and perfectly still in the photographs. "What's your theory?" I asked. Hayes leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I think there's something that moves between these locations. Something that requires specific conditions, isolated water sources, minimal human activity, particular environmental factors." "You're talking about some kind of creature?" "I'm talking about something that doesn't belong in our normal understanding of biology. The footprints are always the same. Too deep, too perfect, leading into water and never coming out. The witnesses describe the same movement patterns, the same unnatural gait." He pulled out a thick file labeled Fabric Analysis and removed several photographs. Each showed pieces of white, flowing material similar to what the dive team had recovered that morning. Every location yields samples of this substance. Laboratory analysis consistently shows the same results. Organic compounds that don't match any known textile or biological material. It appears to be alive at the cellular level, but doesn't conform to any classification system. I stared at the photos, my coffee growing cold. "What happened to the missing people?" "That's the question, isn't it? No bodies ever surface. No remains are found. It's as if they simply cease to exist." Hayes closed the folders and looked at me intently. "But here's what concerns me most about your case. The previous incidents all occurred at natural water formations, lakes, ponds, even large streams. Clearwater Lagoon is artificial, created when they built the highway 30 years ago. So whatever this thing is, it's adapting, learning to use man-made environments. That suggests intelligence, planning, possibly even evolution." I thought about the carved message on my door. The deliberate way the figure had approached the tower, the strategic timing of Martinez's disappearance when she was isolated and vulnerable. Professor, if you're right about this thing moving between locations, how does it travel? These sites are hundreds of miles apart. Hayes smiled grimly. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 20 years. But I have a hypothesis. He pulled out a map of the United States with red pins marking each incident location. When connected, they formed a rough pattern following major underground water systems, aquifers, underground rivers, extensive cave networks. I think it travels through subterranean waterways. That would explain the holes your dive team found on the lagoon floor. It's not just hiding in these bodies of water. It's using them as access points to a much larger underground network. The implications were staggering. If Hayes was right, every isolated lake or pond in the country could potentially become a hunting ground for this thing. What do you think it wants? Based on witness reports and the evidence left behind, I believe it's collecting people. For what purpose, I can only speculate. I finished my coffee and gathered my thoughts. Professor, this is all fascinating, but what does it have to do with finding Martinez? Hayes's expression became deadly serious. Son, if my research is correct, your colleague isn't dead. She's being held somewhere in an extensive underground system, possibly with others who've been taken over the years. Held where? That's what we need to figure out, and we don't have much time. He packed up his files and stood to leave. The pattern shows that after an initial contact or taking, these things typically move on within 72 hours. If we're going to find Martinez, it has to be soon. As I watched Professor Hayes drive away, I realized my night shift at Clearwater Tower had been just the beginning. Martinez was out there somewhere, alive but trapped, and I might be the only person who'd seen enough to help find her. The question was whether I had the courage to go back into those dark woods and face whatever was waiting in the water. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Martinez's face and heard her radio cutting off mid-sentence. Professor Hayes's files kept running through my mind. 12 locations, 7 missing people, an unknown entity that had been hunting for decades. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I called Rodriguez and requested to return to night duty at the tower. "Are you insane?" he asked. "After what happened to Martinez?" "That's exactly why I need to go back. I'm the only one who's seen this thing and lived to tell about it. If Martinez is still alive, the tower gives me the best vantage point to spot any unusual activity. The tower's been shut down pending the investigation. Detective Kim specifically ordered..." "Rodriguez, listen to me. Professor Hayes showed me evidence of similar incidents across the country. If we don't act soon, Martinez could disappear forever, just like the others." There was a long pause. "What others?" I spent 20 minutes explaining Hayes's research and the pattern of disappearances. Rodriguez was skeptical but agreed to contact Detective Kim about reopening the tower for one more night. "If she says yes, you won't be going alone," he said finally. "I'll assign backup units and maintain constant radio contact." Kim was surprisingly receptive to the idea when Rodriguez called her. "If this Professor Hayes is right about the 72-hour window, tonight's our last chance. But I want full surveillance. Radio checks every 15 minutes, backup teams positioned around the lagoon, and emergency response on standby." By 8 p.m., I was climbing the tower stairs again, but this time the forest around me was far from empty. 3 ranger vehicles were positioned at strategic points around the lagoon, their occupants armed and alert. Detective Kim had established a command post at the main parking area, complete with additional communications equipment and a direct line to county emergency services. The carved message was still visible on my doorframe, though someone had attempted to sand down the letters. The gouges were too deep to remove completely, and in the beam of my flashlight, they still spelled out that ominous invitation: "Come down." I settled into the tower cab and ran through my equipment checklist. High-powered binoculars, tactical flashlight, emergency flares, and a backup radio in case my primary unit failed like Martinez's had. Kim had also provided me with something new: a small camera capable of recording in low-light conditions. "If you see anything unusual," she'd said, "document it. We need proof that will hold up in court or scientific review. The night started quietly. Radio checks every 15 minutes confirmed that all backup units were in position and alert. The lagoon looked peaceful in the moonlight, its surface undisturbed except for the occasional ripple from a fish or frog. But as the hours passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the environment. The normal night sounds were muted, as if the forest was holding its breath. The water seemed darker than usual, reflecting less moonlight. Most unsettling of all, the air felt thick and humid despite the cool temperature. At 11:30 p.m., I spotted the first sign that this night would be different. A pale glow was emerging from the lagoon's center, starting as a faint shimmer beneath the surface and gradually growing brighter. It wasn't the harsh white light I'd seen the previous night, but something softer, more organic, like bioluminescence. Command, this is Tower 1. I've got an unusual light source developing in the lagoon center. Appears to be underwater, growing in intensity. Copy, Tower 1. All units report visual contact with the light source. One by one, the backup teams confirmed they could see the glow. Whatever was happening wasn't a hallucination or trick of perspective. The light continued to intensify until it illuminated the entire lagoon from below, turning the dark water an eerie green-blue. But more disturbing than the light itself was what it revealed. Shapes were moving beneath the surface. Lots of them. Command, the underwater lighting is revealing multiple large objects moving through the lagoon. Count at least 6 separate forms, possibly more. I focused my binoculars on the water and felt my stomach drop. The shapes weren't fish or debris. They were human-sized and moving with purpose, swimming in a coordinated pattern around the lagoon's perimeter. All units, maintain positions, but prepare for possible water emergence, Kim ordered. Tower 1, can you identify the nature of these objects? Before I could respond, one of the shapes broke the surface near the eastern shore. In the green glow, I could clearly see what emerged from the water, and my hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the binoculars. It was Martinez, but something was horribly wrong with her. Her skin had taken on the same pale, flowing quality as the fabric we'd found. Her movements were too smooth, too coordinated with the other shapes still swimming below. And when she turned toward the tower, her eyes reflected the underwater light like a nocturnal animal's. Command, I have visual confirmation on Ranger Martinez. She's alive, but altered. Something's wrong with her appearance and behavior. Describe what you're seeing. I struggled to find words for what I was witnessing. Martinez was standing waist-deep in the lagoon, perfectly motionless despite the current that should have been pushing her toward shore. Her ranger uniform had been replaced by that strange white material, which flowed around her like liquid silk. She appears to be physically transformed. Different skin texture, unnatural movement patterns, and her clothing has been replaced by the same material we found yesterday. Other shapes were surfacing now, emerging from the lagoon at various points along the shoreline. I counted 7 figures total, all exhibiting the same disturbing characteristics. But as I watched them more closely, I realized these weren't just random victims. Command, I'm seeing multiple figures emerging from the water. Some of them... God, I think some of them match descriptions from Professor Hayes's missing persons files. The figures were moving onto land now, gliding across the muddy shoreline with that same unnaturally smooth gait I'd observed 2 nights earlier. They spread out in a coordinated pattern, surrounding the lagoon and cutting off escape routes for the backup teams. All units, we have multiple hostiles emerging from the water. Maintain defensive positions and await instructions. But even as Kim gave the order, I could see the backup teams were in trouble. The figures moved faster than any human should be able to, covering ground with impossible speed. Within minutes, they'd surrounded each ranger vehicle. Unit 2, report status, Kim called. Static. Unit 3, respond. More static. One by one, the radio communications with the backup teams went dead. Through my binoculars, I could see flashlight beams wavering and going out as the pale figures closed in on each position. Command, I've lost visual contact with all backup units. The figures have reached their positions. Kim's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Tower 1, you need to get out of there now. Whatever these things are, they're coordinating an attack. But as I turned toward the door, I saw that escape was no longer an option. Pale figures were climbing the tower stairs, moving upward with mechanical precision. Their ascent was completely silent except for the soft whisper of that strange fabric against the metal steps. Command, they're climbing the tower. Multiple figures, approximately 50 feet below my position and ascending. How many? I counted the shapes moving up through the tower's support structure. At least 4, possibly more. ETA to the cab is approximately 3 minutes. Hold your position. Emergency response is en route. But I knew no help would arrive in time. Whatever these things were, they'd planned this operation carefully. The coordinated emergence, the systematic neutralization of backup units, the deliberate assault on the tower. This wasn't random predation. This was intelligent, organized hunting. I grabbed the camera and started recording everything I could see. If I didn't survive the night, at least there would be evidence of what had happened here. The footsteps were getting closer now, and I could hear something else. A low humming sound, like multiple voices singing in harmony. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. A sound that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. Through the windows, I could see more figures emerging from the lagoon. The entire shoreline was covered with pale shapes moving through the night with deadly purpose. But strangest of all was Martinez herself. She was still standing in the shallow water, her transformed face turned upward toward my window. Even at this distance, I could see her mouth moving, as if she was trying to say something. I grabbed the radio for what might be my final transmission. Command, this is Tower 1. If anyone receives this message, the missing persons aren't dead. They've been changed, transformed into something else. The lagoon is just an access point to something much larger. Professor Hayes was right. There's an entire network underground, and it's been collecting people for decades. The footsteps had reached the platform outside my door. I could hear that strange humming getting louder, joined now by scratching sounds as something worked at the doorframe. Command, they're at the door. The pattern shows they want me alive, not dead. If I disappear, follow the underground water systems. Look for other isolated lagoons and lakes. And whatever you do, don't let anyone else work night shifts alone. The scratching stopped. The humming faded to whispers. Then, in a voice that was recognizably Martinez but wrong in every other way, I heard, "Come down." I looked at the camera, still recording, and made my final entry into the official record. This is Ranger David Chen reporting from Clearwater Tower on October 27, 2023 at 2:47 a.m. If you're watching this recording, then I've either escaped or been taken, but I've learned something important about what we're dealing with here. Outside the door, more voices joined the chorus. All of them speaking in unison, all of them saying the same thing. Come down, come down, come down. These aren't creatures from another world, I continued into the camera. They're people who've been changed, transformed by something that lives in the deep underground water systems. It's been collecting victims for decades, turning them into hunters for more prey. The door handle began to turn slowly. The key is the lagoons and isolated lakes. They're access points, doorways to something vast beneath the earth. If you can find the main source, the central location where all these waterways connect, you might be able to stop this thing before it spreads further. The door opened, and Martinez stepped into the cab. In the pale glow of her transformed skin, I could see that her eyes still held traces of human consciousness. She was trying to fight whatever had been done to her, struggling to maintain some fragment of her original self. Martinez, I whispered, lowering the camera. I know you're still in there. For a moment, her expression flickered. Something human passed across her features. Pain, recognition, a desperate plea for help. Then the other figures crowded into the cab behind her, and that brief spark of humanity vanished. They surrounded me but didn't attack. Instead, they stood perfectly still, waiting for something. Martinez spoke again, her voice a harmony of tones that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. You've seen too much. But you can still choose. Come down willingly and keep your mind. Resist and become like us, aware but helpless. I looked at the camera, still recording in my hands. Evidence. Proof of what was happening here. I choose option 3, I said, and before any of them could react, I hurled the camera through the window facing the command post. The device tumbled through the night air, its memory card containing everything I'd recorded. If Detective Kim found it, she'd have the proof needed to stop this thing from spreading. The transformed figures moved toward me with liquid grace, their pale hands reaching out like a tide of cold water. As consciousness faded, I heard Martinez whisper one final message in her own voice. Find the source. Stop the others, before it's too late. Then darkness took me, and I fell into the deep places beneath the earth, where things that were once human waited in the endless night. The camera was recovered the following morning by Detective Kim, along with this complete recording. Ranger David Chen remains missing, along with all backup personnel assigned to the Clearwater operation. The lagoon has been permanently closed to public access, and similar sites across the country are being investigated. Professor Hayes continues his research, now with official support from federal agencies. His current theory suggests a vast underground ecosystem that has been evolving for millennia, only recently beginning to interact with human populations. The hunt for the source continues. If you work in isolated areas near dark water, trust your instincts. Document everything, and never, ever work alone at night. Some things are worse than death, and they're still out there, waiting in the dark. The dashboard clock glowed 3:47 a.m. when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I should have stopped hours ago, should have found a motel room somewhere back in the last town. But stubbornness and the promise of reaching my destination before dawn had kept me pressing forward. Now, with my eyelids growing heavy and my hands cramping around the steering wheel, I was paying the price for that decision. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into absolute darkness. My headlights carved a weak tunnel through the night, illuminating nothing but empty road and the occasional reflective sign marking another mile conquered. The heater in my old pickup truck wheezed and rattled, fighting a losing battle against the October cold that seeped through every gap and crack in the weathered cab. I had been driving for 6 hours straight, fleeing a job that had gone sour and a relationship that had turned toxic. Everything I owned was packed into the bed of the truck, covered by a tarp that flapped ominously in the wind. At 32 years old, I was starting over again, heading toward a construction job in Nevada that promised decent pay and a chance to rebuild my life. But first, I had to survive this endless night. The radio had given up broadcasting anything coherent an hour ago, leaving me with only static and the occasional burst of Spanish-language music from some distant station. I twisted the dial desperately, searching for human voices to keep me company, but found only electronic whispers and empty frequencies. The isolation pressed against my chest like a physical weight. My fuel gauge hovered just above the quarter tank mark, its orange needle pointing accusingly at my poor planning. I had passed the last gas station nearly 50 miles back, dismissing it because the lights were off and it looked abandoned. Now, as the needle crept lower, I was beginning to regret that decision. The thought of running out of gas on this desolate stretch of highway, miles from any help, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold air. The landscape outside remained stubbornly unchanging. Flat scrubland dotted with stunted trees and the occasional abandoned building. No cities glowed on the horizon, no traffic shared the road. It was as if I had driven beyond the edge of civilization into some forgotten corner of the world where normal rules no longer applied. When I finally spotted the lights ahead, my first emotion was pure relief. After another hour of driving through the darkness, watching my fuel gauge needles sink closer to empty, any sign of human presence looked like salvation. But as I drew closer, my relief began to curdle into something else entirely. The gas station emerged from the darkness like something from a fever dream. A single flickering street lamp cast sickly yellow light over the scene, revealing a structure that seemed frozen in time from decades past. The building's white paint had peeled away in long strips, exposing gray wood underneath that looked soft with rot. The windows of what had once been a convenience store were boarded up with plywood, and the few panes of glass that remained were so grimy they looked black in the uncertain light. Two ancient gas pumps stood like tombstones in the center of the lot, their digital displays dark and lifeless. But one pump, the one closest to the road, still had a faint glow emanating from its card reader. The sight of that tiny red light filled me with desperate hope. I pulled up beside it, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out into the biting air. The silence was overwhelming. No traffic sounds, no distant hum of machinery, no voices or music from inside the building. Just the whisper of wind through dry grass and the soft buzz of the failing street lamp. The cold bit into my exposed skin immediately, making me pull my jacket tighter around my chest. My breath formed visible clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. I approached the pump with cautious optimism, sliding my credit card through the reader and waiting for some sign of life. The machine wheezed and clicked, its internal mechanisms struggling to process the transaction. After what felt like an eternity, the display flickered to life, instructing me to select my fuel grade. I had never been so happy to see those glowing numbers. As I began filling my tank, the smell of gasoline sharp in my nostrils. I took a closer look at my surroundings. The building behind the pumps was larger than I had initially thought, with additional structures extending back into the shadows. What I had taken for abandonment might have been something else entirely. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt beside the building, and a few scattered cigarette butts that looked recently discarded. That was when I noticed the black sedan parked in the shadows behind the main building. At first, it was just a darker patch of night, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out its sleek lines and tinted windows. The car was pristine, expensive looking, completely out of place in this desolate setting. And standing around it, barely visible in the darkness, were the silhouettes of several men. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I realized I was not alone. The figures by the black sedan had been so still, so perfectly camouflaged by the darkness, that I had nearly finished fueling before I noticed them. Now that I was aware of their presence, I could not look away. There were 4 of them, all young men in their 20s, dressed inappropriately for the cold night air. They wore tank tops and shorts despite the freezing temperature, their exposed arms covered in elaborate tattoos that seemed to shift and crawl in the uncertain light. They stood with the casual confidence of predators, completely relaxed despite the circumstances that should have left them shivering. What disturbed me most was their absolute stillness. They were not talking among themselves, not smoking cigarettes or checking their phones. They were simply standing there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Even from 50 yards away, I could feel the weight of their collective gaze, studying my every movement as I fumbled with the gas pump. The pump clicked off, signaling that my tank was full, but I found myself reluctant to move. Any motion would draw their attention more directly, might provoke some kind of response. But standing frozen by my truck was not a viable long-term strategy. I needed to get back on the road, to put distance between myself and whatever situation I had stumbled into. I forced myself to move slowly and deliberately, replacing the pump handle and screwing the gas cap back into place. My hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or fear I could not say. The metallic sounds seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence, each click and scrape echoing off the surrounding buildings. As I walked around to the driver's side of my truck, I risked another glance toward the sedan. All 4 men had shifted their position slightly, turning to keep me in their line of sight. The movement was synchronized, almost rehearsed, as if they had done this many times before. One of them took a single step forward, then stopped, waiting. I reached for the door handle of my truck and froze. The men were moving now, no longer content to simply observe. They approached with measured steps, spreading out slightly as they came, their movements coordinated and purposeful. There was nothing casual about their advance. Nothing that suggested this was a friendly approach. Terror flooded my system with a rush of adrenaline that made my vision sharpen and my hearing intensify. Every detail became crystal clear. The soft scuff of their shoes on gravel, the whisper of fabric against skin, the faint sound of their breathing in the cold air. My rational mind screamed at me to run, to get in the truck and drive away as fast as possible. I yanked open the driver's door and threw myself inside, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine hesitated for a moment that felt like an eternity, then roared to life with a sound that seemed to shatter the night's silence. In the rearview mirror, I could see the four men break into a run, no longer bothering with their slow, intimidating approach. The truck lurched forward as I slammed the accelerator to the floor, tires spinning on the loose gravel before finding purchase on the pavement. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands gripped the steering wheel with desperate strength. Behind me, the four men had reached their sedan, and I could see movement in the darkness as they prepared to follow. I had perhaps a 30-second head start, but that black sedan looked built for speed while my pickup truck was designed for hauling loads, not racing. Still, I had one advantage they might not expect. Beneath the hood of my weathered truck sat a carefully modified engine that had been my pride and joy back when I had money for such luxuries. What looked like a working man's beater was actually capable of surprising performance. The speedometer needle climbed rapidly as I pushed the truck harder than I had ever pushed it before. 60 miles per hour, then 70, then 80. The engine responded beautifully, its deep rumble growing to a roar that vibrated through the steering wheel and into my bones. But even as I accelerated, I could see headlights appearing in my rearview mirror, growing brighter as the sedan emerged from the gas station. The highway ahead remained empty and straight, offering no opportunities to lose my pursuers through clever maneuvering. This would be a pure test of speed and endurance, machine against machine, with my life hanging in the balance. The thought of what might happen if they caught me sent another surge of adrenaline through my system. At 90 miles per hour, the truck began to shake slightly, wind noise roaring through the cab despite the closed windows. The yellow lines on the road blurred beneath my headlights, and distant objects seemed to materialize and vanish in seconds. I had never driven this fast in my life, but I had never been running for my life before either. The sedan was gaining ground. In my mirror, I could see its headlights growing larger, the distance between us shrinking with each passing second. Whatever engine that car was carrying, it was more powerful than my modified pickup, but I still had tricks to play. I knew this highway better than they might expect. About 10 miles ahead, there was a series of rolling hills that would test both vehicles' handling capabilities. If I could maintain my lead until then, I might be able to use the terrain to my advantage. The question was whether my truck could hold together under this punishment long enough to reach that section of road. The speedometer now showed 95 miles per hour, and the truck was protesting audibly. Strange rattles and vibrations shook the cab, and I could smell something burning, though whether it was clutch, brakes, or something worse I could not tell. But the engine continued to respond, continued to pull us forward through the night. Behind me, the sedan had closed to within a few hundred yards. At these speeds, that represented only seconds of separation. I could make out individual details now: the car's aggressive front end, the glow of its instrument lights through the windshield, the dark shapes of its occupants. They were so close I half expected to hear their engine over the roar of my own. The chase had been going on for 20 minutes when I began to realize the true nature of what I was dealing with. These were not random criminals looking for an easy target. The coordination of their pursuit, the quality of their vehicle, the professional way they maintained their distance while steadily closing the gap all pointed to something far more dangerous than simple highway robbery. My truck was giving everything it had, but physics was working against me. The sedan was simply more aerodynamic, more powerful, better suited for high-speed pursuit. At 100 miles per hour, I was approaching the absolute limit of what my modified pickup could handle, while my pursuers seemed to have power in reserve. The hills I had been hoping to reach appeared in my headlights, the highway beginning to rise and fall in gentle curves that would test both vehicles' suspension and handling. But as we crested the first hill, I realized my mistake. The sedan was not just faster in a straight line, it was also more agile, taking the curves with a stability that my top-heavy truck could not match. On the downslope of the second hill, they made their move. The sedan pulled into the left lane and began to overtake me, its engine note rising as its driver downshifted for maximum acceleration. I could see the passenger side window rolling down, and the terrible realization hit me that this was about to become something far worse than a simple chase. I swerved hard to the left, trying to force them back behind me, but the sedan's driver was ready for the maneuver. He dropped back slightly, then moved to the right lane, attempting to come up on my passenger side instead. The highway was wide enough for both vehicles, but just barely, and at these speeds, any contact would likely be fatal for both of us. That was when I understood their strategy. They were not trying to ram me off the road. They were trying to box me in, to force me to stop so they could handle whatever business they had with me face to face. The thought of what that business might entail made my blood run cold. I had one more card to play. About a mile ahead, I knew there was an exit ramp leading to a smaller county road. It was a sharp right turn that would be difficult to take at high speed, but if I could make it and they could not, I might be able to lose them in the maze of rural back roads that crisscrossed this part of the state. The exit sign flashed by in my headlights. 1 mile. The sedan was still trying to pull alongside me, its driver showing impressive skill as he matched my erratic movements. I could see the faces of the occupants now, grim and focused, their attention completely fixed on their task. Whatever they wanted with me, they were professionals. 1/2 mile. I began to ease off the accelerator slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make the upcoming maneuver possible. The sedan's driver noticed immediately, pulling even closer, sensing that something was about to happen. The exit ramp appeared suddenly, a sharp right turn marked by a series of yellow warning signs indicating a safe speed of 25 miles per hour. I was doing nearly 90 when I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right and stood on the brakes. The truck went into a controlled slide that tested every modification I had ever made to its suspension system. The rear wheels broke loose first, sending the back end sliding wide as I fought to maintain control. The steering wheel spun in my hands as I tried to counteract the skid, my foot pumping the brake pedal in short, desperate bursts. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to flip. The truck tilted up on 2 wheels as it rounded the curve, gravity and centrifugal force battling for control of my fate. Time seemed to stretch as I hung there, balanced on the edge of disaster, the night sky wheeling overhead through the passenger window. Then the outside wheels touched down again, and I was through the worst of it. The truck straightened out on the narrow county road, its engine coughing and protesting but still running. I had made the turn, but just barely, and at a cost that my vehicle would be paying for miles to come. Behind me, I heard the screech of tires and the angry blare of a horn as the sedan's driver attempted the same maneuver. But their car was moving too fast, carrying too much momentum to make such a sharp turn. I watched in my mirror as they shot past the exit, their brake lights flashing desperately as they tried to slow down enough to attempt a U-turn. The county road was narrow and winding, bordered by ditches and wooden fence posts. It was exactly the kind of terrain where my truck's higher ground clearance and 4-wheel drive would give me an advantage over their low-slung sedan. But I was not out of danger yet. These roads formed a network that eventually connected back to the main highway, and my pursuers would know that as well as I did. I drove hard for another 10 minutes, taking random turns whenever the road forked, trying to put as much distance and confusion between myself and my pursuers as possible. The adrenaline was beginning to fade now, replaced by exhaustion and the shaky aftermath of extreme fear. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I could taste copper in my mouth where I had bitten my tongue during the chase. Finally, I found what I was looking for: an old ranch road that led away from the main network of county highways. It was little more than 2 tire tracks separated by a strip of weeds. But it would take me deeper into the countryside, away from any road that might appear on a standard map. I turned onto it and drove slowly, trying not to think about what would happen if I got stuck out here. The ranch road led to an abandoned farmstead, its buildings dark and empty against the star-filled sky. I pulled behind the largest barn and shut off the engine, sitting in the sudden silence and listening for any sound of pursuit. All I could hear was the ticking of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through broken windows. I waited there for 2 hours, watching the road behind me and jumping at every small sound. No headlights appeared. No engines disturbed the night. Gradually, I began to believe that I had actually escaped, that my desperate gamble with the exit ramp had worked. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I finally felt safe enough to continue my journey. But I took the back roads now, avoiding the highway where this nightmare had begun, and I drove with frequent glances in my mirrors, knowing that some encounters leave scars that never fully heal. 3 days later, I was sitting in a diner in Reno, Nevada, trying to pretend that the coffee in my cup was not shaking from the tremor in my hands. I had made it to my new job, had even managed to work for 2 days without breaking down, but the nights were proving to be a different challenge entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 4 figures approaching my truck, their movements coordinated and predatory. The local news was playing on the television mounted above the counter, and I was only half listening when a story caught my attention. The reporter was standing in front of a familiar-looking gas station, the same sickly yellow street lamp casting its pool of light over the same peeling building I remembered from my nightmare encounter. Discovered this morning by state police investigating reports of suspicious activity. The remote station, located on Highway 50 approximately 30 miles east of Fallon, has apparently been used as a staging area for drug trafficking operations. Authorities recovered nearly 50 pounds of methamphetamine and heroin, along with weapons and cash totaling over $200,000. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands and stared at the screen. The reporter continued her story, but I was no longer hearing the words. All I could see was that building. Those pumps, the exact spot where I had stood 3 nights ago while 4 armed drug dealers watched me from the shadows. The investigation began when a motorist reported being chased by suspected cartel members after stopping at the station for fuel. Nevada State Police credit that anonymous tip with leading them to what they describe as a significant blow to regional drug trafficking operations. Anonymous tip. I had not called the police, had been too shaken and too afraid that they would not believe my story. Someone else must have seen something, must have reported the suspicious activity at the station. But the timing was too convenient, the details too specific for coincidence. I walked to the payphone outside the diner and dialed the number for Nevada State Police, my hands still trembling as I punched in the numbers. When the dispatcher answered, I took a deep breath and identified myself as the motorist who had encountered the suspects at the highway station. The detective who took my statement was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about the men I had seen, their vehicle, and the timeline of events. He seemed unsurprised by my account, as if he had been expecting my call. "You were lucky," he told me when I finished my story. "These were not random criminals looking for a quick score. The group you encountered was part of a sophisticated operation that has been moving drugs through this corridor for months. They were armed and dangerous, and they do not leave witnesses." The weight of those words settled over me like a cold blanket. I had not just escaped a robbery attempt. I had fled from people who would have killed me without hesitation to protect their operation. The thought made my legs weak, and I had to sit down on the curb outside the diner. "The good news," the detective continued, "is that we got them all. 4 suspects in custody, along with their vehicle and a substantial quantity of narcotics. Your description of their car was instrumental in identifying them when they were spotted the next day." I hung up the phone and sat there in the Nevada sun, trying to process what I had learned. Random chance had put me in the path of killers, and random chance had allowed me to escape. But it was more than luck that had saved me. It was the modifications I had made to my truck, the knowledge of local roads I had gained from years of construction work, and a willingness to take desperate risks when my life depended on it. 2 months have passed since that night on Highway 50, and I am finally beginning to sleep through the night again. The construction job in Nevada turned out well, providing steady work and decent pay in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. It is the kind of place where strangers are noticed immediately. where four young men in an expensive sedan would have drawn attention long before they could set up any kind of criminal operation. But the experience has changed me in ways that go beyond simple caution. I no longer drive alone at night unless absolutely necessary, and when I do, I plan my route carefully, making sure I know where every gas station, restaurant, and police station is located. The days of driving until exhaustion forces me to stop are over. I have learned that being prepared can mean the difference between life and death. I keep in touch with Detective Morrison at the Nevada State Police, who updates me occasionally on the progress of the case against my would-be pursuers. The investigation revealed that the gas station had been used as a distribution point for drugs moving from Mexico to markets in the Pacific Northwest. The operation was sophisticated and well-funded, with connections to major cartel organizations. The four men I encountered that night have been charged with numerous federal crimes, including drug trafficking, weapons violations, and conspiracy. Their sentences, when they come, will likely measure in decades rather than years. I will probably be called to testify at their trial, a prospect that fills me with dread and determination in equal measure. What haunts me most is not what happened, but what could have happened. If my truck had been slower, if I had not known about that exit ramp, if I had made any number of different decisions that night, I would not be here to tell this story. The margin between escape and disaster was measured in seconds and split-second decisions. I have also learned something about myself that night. When faced with mortal danger, when reduced to the most basic choice between fight and flight, I discovered reserves of courage and determination I never knew I possessed. The modifications I had made to my truck were not just mechanical improvements. They were preparations for a test I never expected to face. The truck itself bears scars from that night, stress fractures in the suspension, worn brake pads, and a transmission that will never quite shift the same way again. But it brought me through when I needed it most, and I will never forget that debt. Sometimes, late at night when sleep refuses to come, I think about the other travelers who might have stopped at that station before me. The ones who were not as lucky, who did not have a fast truck or knowledge of back roads or the reflexes to make a desperate escape. The detective told me there were no reports of missing persons connected to the station, but drug dealers are experts at making people disappear without a trace. I drive past gas stations sometimes now, particularly the older ones in isolated locations, and I wonder what secrets they might hide. Most are exactly what they appear to be: honest businesses providing essential services to travelers. But some I now know can be far more dangerous than they appear. The experience has given me a healthy respect for the thin line between order and chaos, between safety and danger. In our comfortable modern world, it is easy to forget that predators still exist. That evil is not just a concept from movies and books, but a real force that can intrude into our lives without warning. But I have also learned that ordinary people, when pushed to their limits, are capable of extraordinary things. That a construction worker in an old pickup truck can outrun professional criminals when his life depends on it. That courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. I still make that drive to Nevada regularly for work, but I take the interstate now, stopping only at well-lit truck stops, with plenty of other travelers around. The back roads hold too many memories, too many shadows where danger might be waiting. Some lessons, once learned, change how you see the world forever. And sometimes, on those long, straight stretches of highway with the sun setting behind me and the road stretching endlessly ahead, I remember that night and whisper a prayer of gratitude to whatever force watches over fools and travelers. Because sometimes being lucky is the only thing that stands between us and the darkness that waits just beyond the glow of our headlights. The decision to escape civilization came after 3 months of relentless deadlines and the suffocating buzz of constant notifications. I packed my truck on a Friday evening in late September 2024, determined to find absolute solitude somewhere in the remote valleys of the Cascade foothills. At 32, I had spent too many years glued to screens, and my body craved the kind of silence that only exists miles from any cell tower. The drive took longer than anticipated. Winding mountain roads stretched endlessly before me, each turn revealing another identical ridge of Douglas firs. By 4 in the afternoon, I realized I had miscalculated both the distance and the rapidly shortening daylight hours. The sun hung lower than expected, casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the asphalt like grasping fingers. My truck's engine labored up the steepest grades, and I found myself checking the fuel gauge with increasing frequency. The radio had died to static hours ago, leaving only the sound of tires on pavement and the occasional creak of the vehicle's frame as it navigated the rough patches. I passed the last gas station 30 miles back, a weathered building with pumps that looked like they belonged in another decade. The temperature dropped noticeably as I gained elevation. Through the windshield, I watched patches of early frost glisten on the roadside vegetation. The air smelled different up here, cleaner but somehow thinner, carrying scents of pine sap and decomposing leaves. I cracked the window slightly, letting the mountain air fill the cab, but the chill made me roll it back up within minutes. As the afternoon wore on, I began to question the wisdom of venturing so deep into unfamiliar territory without a concrete camping plan. The original idea had been to find the established campground, but every sign I passed pointed to facilities that were closed for the season or required reservations I had not made. The nearest town was now 40 miles behind me, and turning back would mean driving these treacherous curves in complete darkness. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I navigated another hairpin turn. The road seemed to narrow with each mile, and I'd not seen another vehicle for over an hour. The isolation I had craved was becoming more absolute than I had bargained for, and a growing knot of unease settled in my stomach. The sun was painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson when I encountered another human being for the first time in hours. I had pulled over at a scenic overlook to check my map and consider my dwindling options when footsteps on gravel announced his approach. He emerged from the tree line as if he had been waiting there, a man perhaps in his 50s with weathered skin and clothes that suggested he spent considerable time outdoors. His greeting was friendly enough, asking if I was looking for a place to spend the night. When I explained my predicament, he nodded knowingly and pointed toward a barely visible trail that disappeared into the dense forest below us. He described a hidden camping spot near a river, accessible by vehicle but invisible to casual passers-by. The way he spoke about it, with an almost proprietary familiarity, suggested he had used this location many times before. Something in his demeanor struck me as odd, though I could not articulate exactly what troubled me. Perhaps it was the way his eyes never quite met mine, or how he seemed to know immediately that I was alone and unprepared. He offered to show me the way, and despite a nagging sense of caution, I agreed. The alternative was spending the night in my truck beside the main road, and his knowledge of the area seemed genuine. The man climbed into his own vehicle, an ancient pickup truck that started with a grinding protest, and motioned for me to follow. We descended a dirt road that I would never have noticed on my own, so well was it concealed by overhanging branches and strategic placement of fallen logs. The path twisted through dense undergrowth that scraped against my truck's sides, leaving scratches I would discover later. As we drove deeper into the forest, the canopy overhead thickened until only fragments of sky remained visible. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and moisture began to condense on my windshield. I had to turn on my headlights despite the early hour, their beams illuminating a tunnel of vegetation that seemed to close behind us as we passed. My guide's taillights provided the only reference points in the growing gloom. Several times I lost sight of them around sharp bends, panic rising in my throat until they reappeared ahead. The road descended steadily, and I could hear the sound of rushing water growing louder through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing beside a fast-moving stream. The camping spot was indeed hidden, tucked away behind a screen of willows and wild blackberry bushes. Someone had built a fire ring from river stones, and the ground showed evidence of previous campers. My guide pointed out the best spot to park, mentioned that I would likely have complete privacy, and departed as abruptly as he had appeared, his truck disappearing back up the overgrown trail. Alone in the clearing, I took stock of my surroundings as the last daylight faded from the sky. The river ran perhaps 50 feet from where I planned to park, its constant murmur masking other sounds that might have reached my ears. The fire ring sat in the center of the clearing, surrounded by smooth stones that gleamed wetly in my headlight beams. Evidence of previous campers was everywhere. Flattened areas where tents had been pitched, beer bottles buried in the soft earth, and char marks on nearby trees. The isolation was more complete than I had anticipated. Standing beside my truck, I could not see any trace of the road we had followed, and the forest seemed to press in from all sides like a living wall. The trees were massive here, old-growth firs and cedars that towered overhead and blocked out most of the night sky. Their branches creaked in the wind with sounds like old houses settling, and occasionally something would crash through the underbrush in the distance. I set about making camp with methodical efficiency, partly to stay warm, and partly to quiet the growing unease in my mind. Building a fire became my first priority, both for warmth and for the psychological comfort of light. The kindling caught easily, and soon flames were dancing in the stone circle, casting flickering shadows that made the surrounding trees seem to sway and move. The warmth felt good against my face, but it also created a sphere of light that made everything beyond its reach appear darker by contrast. I arranged a camp chair beside the fire and opened a beer, trying to recapture the sense of peaceful solitude I had sought. The alcohol helped calm my nerves, but it also made me acutely aware of every sound from the darkness beyond my small circle of light. Without cell phone service, I had brought a portable speaker and downloaded several comedy podcasts to keep me company. The familiar voices and laughter helped fill the oppressive silence, though I kept the volume lower than I would have at home. Something about broadcasting my presence into the surrounding forest felt wrong, like sending an invitation to whatever might be listening in the darkness. As the fire burned down to glowing coals, I faced the decision of whether to set up my tent or sleep in the truck. The idea of wrestling with tent poles and stakes in the dark, surrounded by unknown terrain, seemed more daunting than it had in daylight. The truck bed, with its camper shell, offered immediate shelter and the psychological security of metal walls and locking doors. I arranged my sleeping bag and gear in the truck bed, creating a makeshift bedroom that was cramped but serviceable. Through the camper shell's windows, I could see the dying fire and the edge of the forest beyond. The glass felt thin and fragile, but it was better than canvas, and I told myself that any large animal would make enough noise to wake me before it got too close. The night sounds began shortly after I settled into my sleeping bag. What had seemed like peaceful forest ambience during the day transformed into something far more unsettling in complete darkness. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every splash from the nearby river seemed amplified and potentially threatening. The comedy podcast continued playing softly, but the laughter began to feel inappropriate and intrusive in the wilderness setting. Through the truck's windows, I could see the fire's orange glow gradually dimming to deep red coals. The circle of light it provided grew smaller with each passing hour, and the darkness beyond seemed to press closer. Several times I thought I saw movement at the edge of the light, but when I focused on the spot, nothing was there. My imagination began to populate the shadows with threats that logic told me were unlikely, but fear insisted might be real. The sleeping bag was warm enough, but the truck bed was unforgiving against my spine and shoulders. Every time I shifted position, the metal floor transmitted the sound through the vehicle's frame, making me acutely aware of how much noise I was generating. The podcast helped mask some of the external sounds, but it also prevented me from hearing what might be approaching from outside. Around midnight, something large moved through the brush on the far side of the clearing. The sound was deliberate and sustained, not the quick scurrying of a small animal, but the steady progress of something substantial. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath and straining to listen over the podcast's audio. The movement seemed to circle the camp at a distance, never coming close enough to the dying fire for me to see what was causing it. My hand found the bear spray I had placed beside my sleeping bag, and I gripped it tightly while trying to convince myself that whatever was out there was probably just a deer or elk coming to drink from the river. The rational part of my mind knew that most large animals would avoid a human camp, especially one with the lingering scent of fire and food. But the primitive part of my brain, the part evolved from prey animals, screamed warnings that I could not entirely dismiss. The sounds eventually faded, but they left me wide awake and hypersensitive to every whisper of wind through the trees. I found myself holding my breath for long periods, listening for the return of footsteps or the snap of branches that might indicate something was still nearby. The podcast became an annoyance rather than a comfort, its cheerful banter a jarring contrast to my growing anxiety. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of being watched and stalked. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was lying in the truck bed while something pressed its face against the windows, breathing heavily and leaving condensation on the glass. I woke with a start, heart hammering, and immediately checked all the windows for signs of the dream intruder. Finding nothing, I told myself it was just anxiety manifesting in my subconscious, but the feeling of being observed persisted until dawn. The first light of morning brought a false sense of security that lasted exactly as long as it took me to climb out of the truck and survey my surroundings. The fire had died completely, leaving only cold ashes and blackened stones. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening but somehow more alien, as if I were seeing it clearly for the first time. Moisture hung in the air, creating a thin mist that made distant objects appear to shimmer and shift. I set about rekindling the fire, more for the comfort of the ritual than for warmth. The morning was crisp but not uncomfortable, and I looked forward to a hot breakfast and coffee before beginning the journey home. The plan was simple: eat, pack up, and leave this place with its unsettling atmosphere behind me. I had gotten the solitude I sought, perhaps more than I had bargained for, and now I craved the safety and predictability of civilization. The kindling caught easily, and soon flames were dancing again in the stone circle. I arranged my camping chair beside the fire and began preparing a simple meal of instant oatmeal and coffee. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, and I began to feel foolish about the previous night's anxiety. Daylight had a way of making nighttime fears seem overblown and irrational. It was while I was stirring the oatmeal that I first noticed the figure at the edge of the clearing. He stood just inside the tree line, perhaps 30 yards away, partially obscured by the morning mist and the shadows of the forest. At first glance, I thought he might be another camper who had emerged from a tent I had somehow missed in the darkness. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, the details became increasingly disturbing. The man was tall and gaunt, dressed in layers of clothing that appeared to have been accumulated over months or years without laundering. But it was not his disheveled appearance that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was the hundreds of plastic bags tied to his body like grotesque ornaments. Grocery bags, shopping bags, trash bags, all knotted around his arms, legs, and torso until he resembled some nightmarish scarecrow that had wandered away from its post. The bags moved constantly in the slight breeze, creating a soft rustling sound that was barely audible over the river's murmur, but somehow carried clearly across the clearing. They were tied with such precision and abundance that his human form was almost completely obscured, creating a silhouette that belonged in a fever dream rather than a peaceful morning campsite. He stood perfectly still, facing in my general direction but not looking directly at me. His posture suggested awareness of my presence, but there was something fundamentally wrong about his behavior. No greeting, no acknowledgement, no explanation for his bizarre appearance or his presence in this remote location. He simply stood there like a monument to madness, the plastic bags whispering their secrets to the morning air. My appetite vanished instantly, replaced by a cold dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. Every instinct screamed that this encounter was not going to end with a friendly exchange of camping stories. The man's very presence felt like a violation of the natural order, as if something that should have remained hidden in the deepest parts of the forest had chosen to reveal itself in the growing daylight. Minutes passed in tense silence as we regarded each other across the clearing. I remained seated beside my fire, spoon halfway to my mouth with cooling oatmeal, while he maintained his motionless vigil at the forest's edge. The plastic bags continued their constant rustling, a sound that began to feel like whispered threats in a language I could not understand but somehow knew was malevolent. My mind raced through possible explanations for his appearance and behavior. Perhaps he was mentally ill, a homeless individual who had wandered into the wilderness and constructed this bizarre costume from discarded materials. Maybe he was under the influence of drugs that had distorted his perception of reality. Or possibly, he was playing some elaborate prank, though the remoteness of the location made that seem unlikely. None of these rational explanations adequately addressed the pure wrongness of his presence. There was something fundamentally disturbing about the way he held himself, the deliberate positioning of his body, and the calculated nature of his stillness. This was not random behavior or the actions of someone who was simply lost or confused. This felt purposeful and predatory. I forced myself to take a sip of coffee, trying to project an air of calm I did not feel. The hot liquid burned my tongue, but the pain helped focus my attention and prevent panic from overwhelming my judgment. I needed to handle this situation carefully without escalating whatever was happening into something more dangerous. "Good morning," I called out, keeping my voice steady and friendly despite the fear that was coursing through my system. "Beautiful day for camping, isn't it?" No response. He remained frozen in place, though I thought I detected a slight tilting of his head, as if he were listening to something I could not hear. The bags rustled more vigorously for a moment, then settled back into their previous rhythm. I tried a different approach. "Are you hungry? I've got plenty of food if you'd like to join me for breakfast." Again, no verbal response, but this time he shifted his weight slightly, causing the entire collection of bags to sway and dance. The movement was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, like watching seaweed move in underwater currents. I found myself staring at the constantly shifting patterns, trying to discern the human form beneath the plastic camouflage. The silence stretched between us, growing more oppressive with each passing second. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel sweat beginning to form on my palms despite the cool morning air. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming warnings, telling me to run, to fight, to do anything except continue this surreal standoff. "Look," I said, standing up slowly and keeping my hands visible. "I don't know what you want, but I'm just here camping. I'm not looking for any trouble." For the first time, he moved. Not toward me or away, but in a slow, deliberate circle around the perimeter of the clearing. His movements were fluid and purposeful, like a predator testing the boundaries of its territory. The bags created a constant susurration that seemed to grow louder as he moved, until it became the dominant sound in the morning air. My hand moved instinctively to the bear spray clipped to my belt. The weight of it was reassuring, but I knew that using it would escalate the situation beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Still, the presence of some form of defense helped keep the rising panic at bay. The stranger's circling behavior continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. He moved with the patience of something that had no concept of time, no urgent need to be anywhere else or do anything else. His entire existence seemed focused on this moment, this place, and whatever purpose had brought him to my campsite on this particular morning. I tried one more time to establish communication, calling out an offer of coffee or food, but my voice sounded thin and desperate in the morning air. The lack of any human response was perhaps more terrifying than an aggressive action would have been. At least aggression was a behavior I could understand and react to. This calculated indifference was completely outside my experience. My fear finally crystallized into anger, a hot surge of emotion that cut through the paralysis of uncertainty. I was tired of being toyed with, tired of feeling like prey being evaluated by a predator. If he wanted confrontation, I would give it to him on my terms. "Acknowledge me or get out," I shouted, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "I'm not playing whatever game this is." I pulled the bear spray from my belt and held it up where he could see it clearly, hoping the threat of pain would break through whatever mental fog was driving his behavior. The canister felt solid and purposeful in my hand, a tangible reminder that I was not completely helpless in this situation. The effect was immediate and dramatic. He stopped his circling motion and turned to face me directly for the first time since his appearance. Even with the bags obscuring his features, I could sense his attention focusing on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey locked in a moment of mutual recognition. Then, without warning or explanation, he turned and walked back into the forest with the same deliberate pace he had maintained throughout the encounter. The bags rustled and whispered as he moved, the sound gradually fading as the trees swallowed his bizarre silhouette. Within seconds, he had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. I stood frozen beside my dying fire, bear spray still raised, waiting for him to reappear or for some other shoe to drop. The morning sounds of the forest gradually returned. Bird calls, wind through the trees, the constant murmur of the river. But underneath these normal sounds, I imagined I could still hear the whisper of plastic bags moving through the underbrush. The spell broke suddenly, and I snapped into frantic action. Breakfast forgotten, fire abandoned, I began throwing my gear into the truck with desperate efficiency. Every second he was out of sight was a second he could be positioning himself for another approach, possibly from a direction where I would not see him coming. The truck started on the first try, and I had never been more grateful for the sound of an internal combustion engine. I reversed quickly from the camping spot, tires spinning on the soft ground, and headed up the overgrown trail that had brought me to this nightmare location. Branches scraped against the truck's sides, but I did not slow down until I reached the main road. The drive back to civilization was a blur of adrenaline and relief. I did not stop until I reached the first town with cell phone service, where I sat in a McDonald's parking lot for an hour, trying to process what had happened in that hidden valley. The normalcy of suburban life, with its traffic lights and chain restaurants and ordinary people going about their daily routines, felt like a different universe from the one I had just escaped. Part of me wanted to report the incident to local authorities, but what would I tell them? That I had encountered a man covered in plastic bags who had stood still and watched me eat breakfast. No crime had been committed, no direct threat had been made. By any objective measure, nothing had actually happened except an unusual encounter in the wilderness. But I knew that something significant had occurred in that clearing, something that challenged my understanding of normal human behavior and the safety of solitude. The memory of those rustling bags and that calculating stillness would not fade, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that place. In the weeks that followed, I found myself researching missing persons cases in the area, looking for reports of other campers who might have encountered the same individual. I scoured online forums and social media groups dedicated to outdoor activities, searching for stories that might corroborate my experience. I found nothing concrete, but there were enough vague references to strange encounters and weird people in the woods to convince me that I was not the only one who had stumbled into something unsettling. The experience changed my relationship with solitude and wilderness camping. The peace and restoration I had sought in that remote valley had been replaced by a constant awareness of vulnerability and the thin veneer of civilization that protects us from the truly aberrant elements of human society. Every camping trip since has been to established campgrounds with other people nearby, and I no longer venture into truly remote areas alone. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I wonder about the stranger with the plastic bags. Was he a local character, well known to residents but invisible to casual visitors? Was he dangerous, or simply eccentric in a way that triggered primal fears? Had he been camping in that valley for days or weeks before my arrival, watching other visitors with the same unsettling intensity? The questions multiply without answers, but one certainty remains. I was wise to trust my instincts and leave when I did. Whatever his intentions might have been, whatever purpose drove him to adorn himself with those whispering plastic ornaments and lurk in the forest shadows, I did not want to discover it through direct experience. The memory serves as a reminder that true wilderness contains more than just natural dangers. Sometimes the most frightening predators are the ones that walk upright and should know better, the ones that have abandoned the social contracts that allow civilization to function. In seeking to escape the pressures of modern life, I had stumbled into something far more primitive and threatening. I still seek solitude in nature, but I do so with greater wisdom and preparation now. The mountains and forests offer restoration and peace, but they also harbor secrets that are better left undisturbed. Some valleys should remain hidden, some clearings should stay empty, and some encounters should never happen at all. The plastic bags still rustle in my nightmares, and I suspect they always will.